Imagine living in a world where your life could be dictated not by your own choices, but by the sins of your spouse. A world where devotion to faith, obedience to God, and adherence to strict church law could seal your fate in chains. In 1089, Pope Urban II, the same pope who would later call the First Crusade, convened the Synod of Melfi. Amid discussions on clerical discipline and church reform, he issued a decree so severe, so morally staggering, that it forever changed the lives of countless women. This decree allowed secular authorities to enslave the wives of priests who had violated their vows of celibacy. It was a punishment not for the guilty, but for those associated with them. The innocent bore the weight of the church's authority, stripped of dignity, property, and freedom, all in the name of moral enforcement. Why would a spiritual leader claiming to act in God's name sanction such cruelty? Why target women for crimes they did not commit? Stay with us until the end, and you'll uncover the shocking truth about Pope Urban II, the Synod of Melfi, and the consequences that ripple through history to this very day. The late 11th century was a time of fragmentation, instability, and transformation in Europe. Kingdoms were small, power decentralized, and local lords often wielded more influence than kings. Amid this chaotic political landscape, the Catholic Church stood as one of the few unifying forces. Yet even within the Church, problems were rife. Corruption was rampant, simony, the buying and selling of church offices, was common, and clerical celibacy, though mandated, was often ignored. Many priests maintained families, passed their offices to their children, and openly flouted church law. Clerical celibacy had a dual purpose. On one hand, it symbolized moral purity and spiritual focus. On the other, it prevented church wealth and land from being inherited by priests' families, keeping assets within ecclesiastical control. But enforcement was weak. Some priests had concubines, others married openly, and church reformers feared that the credibility of the clergy and the church itself was at stake. Enter Pope Urban II, elected in 1088. A reformer by temperament, he aimed to restore moral authority, centralize power under the papacy, and ensure obedience from the clergy. Yet the church lacked a system to police priests across Europe. Urban II faced a dilemma: how to enforce celibacy without turning every parish into a battleground. His solution would be radical and morally troubling. In September 1089, Pope Urban II convened 70 bishops, 12 abbots at Melfi, a meeting now remembered as the Synod of Melfi. The goal was ambitious: reform the clergy, enforce moral discipline, and restore the church's credibility. One of the most controversial decrees addressed clerical celibacy. Priests who violated their vows would face punishment, but the decree did not stop there. The wives of these priests were to be punished as well by being enslaved under the authority of secular rulers. At the time, this was presented as a deterrent. By threatening the families of priests, the church hoped to enforce strict adherence to its laws. Delegating enforcement to secular authorities allowed the church to maintain moral authority while using earthly power to implement its will. But the moral implications were profound. Innocent women, wives who had no role in violating vows, were punished for crimes they did not commit. Chroniclers of the time described the decree as both shocking and terrifying. It was a public assertion of church power, a warning that disobedience would carry consequences not just for the individual, but for their family as well. The consequences of Urban II's decree were immediate and devastating. Women were seized, stripped of rights, and sold into slavery. Some were sent to distant regions, never to see their homes or families again. Contemporary accounts describe the suffering in stark terms. These women were treated not as human beings, but as instruments of moral enforcement. Their fates were decided by laws they had no control over. The punishment was also symbolic. It served as a warning to priests: obey, or those you love most will pay the price. It created a climate of fear and reinforced the church's authority. In a patriarchal society with limited legal protection for women, this decree placed them in a position of utter vulnerability. Many chroniclers note the injustice. The women's lives were destroyed for the sins of their husbands, highlighting the human cost of church authority. The societal impact was also far-reaching. Communities witnessed the punishment of wives and families, reinforcing obedience and deterring violation of clerical vows. The Synod of Melfi was not just about celibacy. It was about asserting power over both clergy and society. If you're intrigued by this hidden chapter of church history, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell. By doing so, you'll stay updated on more stories like this, revealing the secret and often dark aspects of history that textbooks leave out. The Synod of Melfi's decree was not an isolated case. The Catholic Church's relationship with slavery spans centuries, oscillating between condemnation and tacit approval depending on political and religious needs. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued Dum Diversas, authorizing Portuguese rulers to enslave non-Christians in Africa. Later, Romanus Pontifex reinforced this authority. Meanwhile, Pope Paul III's 1537 bull Sublimis Deus condemned the enslavement of indigenous peoples, but European powers largely ignored it. Urban II's decree reflects the same tension, enforcing church law versus the human cost. By giving secular rulers the power to enslave clerics' wives, Urban II ensured obedience, but at immense moral and ethical cost. This event illustrates the Church's capacity to wield authority beyond spiritual guidance, shaping society and the lives of ordinary people. It also highlights the paradox of an institution preaching compassion, yet sanctioning profound cruelty. Historians remain divided on Urban II's motivations. Some argue pragmatism. Without direct enforcement power, he had no choice but to delegate punishment to secular authorities. Others argue it was an abuse of power. Innocent women were punished for crimes committed by their husbands, raising questions about collective responsibility and human rights. This episode sparks broader ethical reflections. How far should institutions go to enforce rules? Is collective punishment ever justified? Medieval society was hierarchical and patriarchal, but even in this context, the targeting of innocent women remains morally troubling. Scholars use the Synod of Melfi to explore the intersection of authority, morality, and enforcement, a topic still relevant today. Urban II's actions expose a harsh truth about power. Authority, when unchecked, often sacrifices the vulnerable for institutional goals. The wives of priests were punished not for sins, but as instruments of control. Their suffering was intended to reinforce obedience and assert moral authority. But at what cost? This raises questions about gender and power. Women were made scapegoats, illustrating how patriarchal structures magnified their vulnerability. The Synod of Melfi also offers insight into how institutions enforce rules. Sometimes enforcement becomes more about fear than morality, creating consequences that ripple across generations. The decree of the Synod of Melfi left a lasting legacy. It demonstrates the Church's power to regulate not only clergy, but their families. It also shows the moral compromises made in the pursuit of control. For historians, this is a window into the tensions between law, morality, and human cost. For society, it is a warning. Obedience and authority should never come at the expense of innocent lives. Even today, this story resonates. It forces reflection on how institutions exercise power, how moral authority can conflict with human decency, and how history is rarely black and white. Every action taken in the name of morality or order can carry consequences far beyond what was intended. Urban II's decree reminds us that even institutions claiming divine authority can make decisions that are morally questionable. It challenges modern audiences to think critically about the balance between law, power, and human rights, lessons that are still relevant in today's world.